They said he looked forgettable. Not scary, not monstrous, just a man in a room. But in Portland, Oregon, between 1991 and 1993, at least 4 women would never make it out of their homes alive. They were mostly elderly, mostly alone, and to him they were easy. That's not speculation. That's what he said himself, coldly, casually. They gave up easy. Too easy. His name was Cesar Francesco Barone, born Adolph James Road, a name he tried to erase like everything else before the killings began. But you can't erase what creates you. In just under 3 years, he hunted women like prey, stalking, breaking in, raping, and killing. Each scene was eerily quiet, no signs of struggle, as if the life had drained from the room long before he stepped in. Authorities believe there were more. The timelines don't match. The gaps are too neat. And his past, his hidden past, includes whispers of violence even before Oregon, before America. Even Panama has questions it never got answered. The pattern wasn't blood, it was power. And the victims. They weren't chosen at random. They reminded him of someone, or perhaps they replaced someone. This wasn't madness in the way most people imagine it. It wasn't a man foaming at the mouth or screaming at the moon. It was calm, clinical, a calculated cruelty dressed in human skin. So the question is this: how does a boy, abandoned, beaten, unwanted, grow into a man who smiles while killing? And even more haunting, how many others like him are just waiting to be seen? He was 3 when she left. No note, no last kiss, just silence. That was his mother's final gift. From that moment on, Adolph James Road, the boy who would later rename himself Cesar Barone, was no longer a child with a family. He was a question no one wanted to answer. His father wasn't a man built for love. He beat him often, starved him when he cried too much. Sometimes for reasons even the boy didn't understand, he'd be locked in a room for hours. Just him, and the sound of dishes breaking in the kitchen. Sometimes the sound stopped, and that was even worse. He clung to one thing, an old cloth doll missing an eye. A doll left behind by a girl at the orphanage before him. No one remembered her name. The toy wasn't even his. But in his world, it was the only thing that didn't hit back. It would become the symbol of his entire emotional life, broken, abandoned, silent. Transferred from home to home, orphanage to orphanage, Cesar never learned how to trust. He only learned how to survive. That meant hiding emotions. It meant expecting pain. And when that pain didn't come from others, it came from within. There are terms in psychology for this disorganized attachment where a child sees their caregiver as both a source of comfort and terror. Childhood PTSD, where the brain reshapes itself around fear. By age 6, he had already started killing animals. Quietly, not out of rage, but curiosity. He wanted to see what it felt like to have power over something that couldn't fight back. And for the first time, something inside him whispered, "You don't have to be afraid if they're the ones who fear you." They laughed when he spoke. Not because he was funny, but because his voice cracked and his words stumbled. Teachers called him distracted. Classmates called him creepy. And Cesar, still Adolph back then, learned quickly that school was not a place to learn. It was a place to disappear. He sat in the back row, always. Never raised his hand, never smiled when the others did. No one asked why. When he brought bruises to school, they went unnoticed. When he stopped talking altogether, no one missed the sound. Invisible kids don't draw questions. At recess, he walked the edges of the playground like a ghost, watching, waiting. Not for friends, but for the moment it would all end. He fantasized not about games or future careers, but about burning the school down. A building full of people who looked at him and saw nothing. Psychologists call this early social trauma. When the need for connection is met with rejection, the brain begins to rewrite the self. You are not lovable. You are not seen. That's when the roots of antisocial personality disorder start to form. But these roots don't grow outward. They dig in and rot silently. At home, he was beaten. At school, ignored. So he created his own world where he mattered. A world where those who hurt him paid a price. A world where being invisible was just the first step to becoming untouchable. And by the time he turned 13, the doll he once clung to was buried in the yard. He told himself it was just a toy, but deep down he knew he hadn't buried a doll. He had buried the last piece of someone who could be loved. Something cracked during puberty, but it didn't break outward, it twisted inward. By 14, Cesar was stealing from neighbors. Not for survival, not even for thrill, just to prove he could walk into their world, take something, and leave without being seen. It was control, and it tasted better than food. At 15, he assaulted his stepmother. No one believed her at first. She was hysterical, crying, ashamed. He stood there blankly, calm, said she misunderstood. The family called it a phase. But phases don't escalate, disorders do. This was the age where signs of what criminologists call the McDonald triad often emerge, a cluster of behaviors linked to future violence, cruelty to animals, arson, and persistent bedwetting. Cesar hit 2 of those, but he added his own manipulation. He lied with ease, created stories, made teachers believe he was improving, made counselors think he cared. This is called masking, a psychological defense where someone hides deviant impulses behind the illusion of normality. But the more he wore the mask, the less he remembered who he was beneath it. There were moments, fleeting ones, where something human tried to surface. He once wrote a poem about a broken door and a quiet scream. But when another boy found it and mocked him, Cesar laughed along, then tore it to pieces. The boy who wrote it never came back. At night he talked to himself. Sometimes in whispers, sometimes in anger, not asking for help, just practicing for the man he was becoming. And one day he looked in the mirror not to see himself, but to perfect the face he'd wear for the rest of his life. Smile, nod, fit in, but never forget they don't matter. From the outside, he looked like he made it. He joined the army, wore the uniform, saluted the flag, called his superiors sir with a crispness that made them believe he'd finally found discipline. But inside, nothing changed. Cesar Barone, no longer Adolph Rode, had learned how to mimic what people expected. He laughed when others did, held eye contact just long enough, used polite words, remembered birthdays. It was all performance. The military, with its rigid structure, gave him a mask that fit perfectly the obedient soldier. But cracks began to show. He was reprimanded for insubordination, investigated for assault. His temper was always close beneath the surface, and when his tour ended, the mask came off. He returned to civilian life with no friends, no family, no purpose except one: control. He began breaking into homes quietly, methodically. Not to steal, not for money. He waited until the women inside were vulnerable, often elderly, often alone, and then he raped them. For him, this wasn't about lust. It was about domination, about forcing someone to feel as powerless as he once had. In psychology, we call this a power reversal fantasy. Those who were once victims recreate the roles, only this time they're the one in charge. But instead of healing, it amplifies the wound. To the outside world, he was just a man in town. To the women he targeted, he was a ghost in the night. And to himself, he was finally becoming something more than forgotten. He smiled at strangers, dated casually, even considered starting a family. But in the silence of his apartment, one question never stopped echoing. If no one ever loved me, why should I care who gets hurt? Every mask eventually slips. For Cesar, it didn't shatter in one moment, it eroded. Quietly, daily, like acid dripping behind his eyes. We don't know the exact trigger. Some say it was rejection, he had trouble maintaining relationships. Others point to financial collapse. He couldn't hold a job, couldn't keep friends, couldn't stay sober. But most likely, it wasn't one thing. It was everything, the whole illusion collapsing. When he was discharged from the military and stripped of the identity he had worn so well, something inside him snapped. Not with a scream, but with a whisper. This world owes me. It's here that we see what psychologists call a cognitive collapse, a point where someone's internal belief system turns hostile. The self becomes the victim, and the rest of the world becomes the threat. He began to stalk his targets more deliberately. He waited, observed, learned their routines. And then sometime in 1991, in a quiet home in the Portland suburbs, he crossed the line. She was elderly, alone. She trusted her locks, her curtains, her routine. None of them mattered. He raped her, then strangled her, then cleaned himself up like it was just another day. But that night, as he stood outside the house watching the lights fade, something clicked. It wasn't chaos. It was peace. The void inside him didn't scream anymore, it purred. Psychologists might point to Freud's death, drive the instinct toward destruction both of the self and others. But Cesar wouldn't have known that name. He just knew that for once he didn't feel small, and he thought to himself, they give up so easy. There was no rush, no panic, no frenzy, just precision. Cesar Barone didn't kick down doors or scream commands. He slipped in like a shadow, unannounced, unnoticed, undesired. And once he was inside, it was like time stopped. To him, the act wasn't about rage, it was a ritual. The victims, mostly elderly women, were chosen carefully, not because of who they were, but because of what they represented. Helplessness, trust, the very things he never had. When asked later how he chose them, he simply shrugged. They gave up easy. It wasn't just cruelty, it was efficiency. He didn't torture. He didn't mutilate. He didn't need to. His weapon wasn't a knife or a gun, it was his presence. And once he had stripped them of their last defense hope, he ended them. One psychologist described it as emotional detachment fused with control pathology, a complete inability to feel human connection paired with an obsession for power. That's why the crime felt quiet, like watching someone tie their shoes or fold laundry. It was routine, practiced, inevitable. Some killers get addicted to the chaos. Barone got addicted to the stillness. There were no grand statements, no signature symbols, no taunts to the police, just a consistent pattern of stalking, overpowering, silencing, and then disappearing. In those moments, while life drained from the women he attacked, he didn't feel like a monster. He felt clean, whole, in control for the first time in a life built on loss. And as he walked back into the night, the world continued on oblivious, because who would ever suspect the man with the calm smile and empty eyes? He didn't run, he didn't hide, he just moved on. Cesar Barone didn't view murder as a climax. It wasn't the end of a story, it was the beginning of a pattern. After each killing, he returned to life as usual, shopping, eating, sometimes even flirting with women in cafes, as if nothing had happened. And that's exactly how he wanted it. This is what we call compartmentalization, a defense mechanism where the mind splits reality into sealed boxes. There's the man who makes eye contact with the cashier, and there's the man who watches life fade from another person's eyes. He kept them separate. And that separation made him dangerous. There was no remorse, no guilt, only a growing hunger for repetition. Each time it got easier, each time the voice inside that used to scream had less to say, until it was just quiet. He was no longer reacting to pain, he was planning it. Police believe he murdered at least 4 women, but many suspect more victims across multiple states, possibly Panama. The gaps in his timeline are too convenient. The way he traveled, the people he knew, the hours unaccounted for. Serial behavior is rarely spontaneous. It's structured, and Barone had found his rhythm. He became colder, sharper. His kills were not crimes of passion, they were expressions of power. Forensic psychologists might call this psychopathic drift a deepening numbness, where morality no longer registers, only necessity. And after each woman stopped breathing, after the silence returned, Cesar didn't feel regret. He felt something worse, peace.
It ended not with a chase, but with a mistake.
In 1993, police linked Cesar Barone to one of the rapes. DNA sealed it, but when they looked closer, when they compared unsolved murders, matched timelines, and combed through his past, they uncovered a trail of death hidden in plain sight. When officers came to arrest him, he didn't resist. He didn't plead. He didn't even look surprised.
He just said, "Took you long enough."
In custody, he sat still, calm, polite. When asked about the women, he shrugged. When shown photos of his victims, he barely blinked. The courtroom watched for signs of remorse. None came.
He stared at the judge like one stares at a traffic light, waiting, not caring.
One reporter described him as chillingly normal. Another said he looked more bored than dangerous. But behind those eyes was the same man who once said they gave up easy. Too easy. He was sentenced to death in 1995. He died in prison in 2009 quietly, like the way he lived. No final words, no confession, just a name in a file. Behind bars, he didn't cry. He didn't scream. He simply became still. There's a concept in psychology called the hollow self, a person who never fully formed because the core of their identity was abandoned early, left empty. That's who Cesar Barone was in the end. Not a man, not a monster, just hollow. And as they led him from the courtroom, witnesses reported one final detail. He was smiling. He wasn't born a killer. He was born a boy who cried too long, went too hungry, loved too hard, and was met with silence every time. By the time Cesar Barone murdered his first victim, the world had already failed him 100 times. At home, at school, in the places meant to help. He didn't explode overnight, he eroded. Some call him evil, others insane. But in the realm of forensic psychology, we don't ask if someone is evil. We ask, how did they get this way? The truth is this: no one becomes a predator without first being prey. What if someone had listened when his stepmother cried out? What if a teacher had asked about the bruises? What if when that boy buried his only toy, someone had noticed the grave in the yard? We will never know how many more he could have hurt, and we may never know how many more like him are walking beside us now, because these stories don't begin with a scream. They begin with a whisper, a child left alone in a room, a doll left behind in the dirt. That's the most terrifying part. It's not the blood, it's the silence that comes before it. Cesar Barone is gone, but the story he leaves behind isn't just about what he did.
It's a question.
How many more are waiting quiet, invisible, hoping someone sees them before it's too late?
And if we don't listen now,
what will they become?